that I feel make him seem more of an enigma. I have had to use printed sources to pull this talk together, and there is a lot more to be followed up once I have time. So please excuse, therefore, the somewhat raw nature of this presentation. We know a vast amount more about Thomas's famous son Gideon. He was born on 3rd of February 1790 in St Mary's Lane, the third son. After an education in Lewes and care of his uncle in Swindon, Gideon followed a 5-year apprenticeship on the High Street in Lewes with Dr. James Moore between the ages of 15 and 20. After a time in London with the great Dr. Abernethy, he was recorded as back living with his mother in 1812 in St Mary's Lane. He then took on the practice as the local doctor from Dr. Moore and moved eventually into the house known as Castle Place on the High Street. He moved there in 1833. He moved there from there in 1833 to 20 the Steine in Brighton. Just to make a note that the very grand building was built by Eamon Wilds and has his trademark horns of Ammon, which you'll see at the top here, which were his motif, and of course linked very much to the idea of an ammonite, which has the same rounded look, of which Gideon found very, very many in the cliffs around, fossils of which in the cliffs around Lewes. But that we're not talking about Gideon tonight, we're talking about his father. So not only was he an author in his own right with hundreds of published papers, letters and correspondence with other famous people, much of which is available, he kept a diary from 1818 until just before his death in 1852. He wrote an anonymous story of his life as a surgeon in Lewes, and we also have much was written about him by others. We don't, however, have the same for his father. The picture we see here is Gideon, is one of 3 in the keep, which had been hanging in Castle Place. This one was purported to be in the possession of his brother-in-law after his death, and we shall see the other 2 in a minute. Here we have an outline of the Mantell family tree. Mantell, it's spelt differently at different times. I will probably vary between one and the other. So here we have the Mantells moved to Lewes in the 16th century, having fallen foul of the law. Walter Mantell was executed for supporting the Wyatt Rebellion in Kent in 1554, which was raised against the marriage of Mary II to Philip of Spain. The family could be traced back to William the Conqueror's time, with a Mantell being listed in the roll of Battle Abbey as a knight who accompanied him in the conquest in 1066. According to Gideon's notes, the Mantell or de Mantell family originated in Abbeville. There had been an earlier older brother, Thomas, to our Thomas, who you can see in the centre. And our Thomas, his father, grandfather, and other Mantell or ancestors were also named Thomas. Oh, I don't know if you can see that. Sorry. Thomas himself named his oldest son Thomas Austin, and that is Gideon's elder brother. Yeah. Our Thomas had an older living brother, the Reverend George Mantell, who lived in Swindon and who provided a home and education to the young Gideon. We have Reverend George here. So let's say hello to Thomas. Oops. Oh dear. I'm losing my... Can you hear me? I'm trying to move on my slides and it's not working. Elaine, slides, something's gone. Hang a minute. Something's gone. It came up with a message saying the internet was unstable. I'm trying to move the slide down. I'm going to try again, if you can hear me, and restart. Came up with a message on the internet. Down. Yeah. Thank you, technical assistant. Phew, glad you were lurking outside the door. Okay, let's say hello to Thomas and Sarah. These two pictures are the other ones on the, that were in the set of 3 in the keep. They are actually photos of previously known pictures, the whereabouts of which are no longer known. They're listed as possibly the parents and may have hung on the walls in Castle Place. Their dress seems right enough. As we see, Thomas died young at 57, and we have little information about his personality, apart from what we can glean from his actions and associates. We have to rely on printed sources and supposition. Sarah went on to live until 1828, still in the house in St Mary's Lane, as far as we can tell. Thomas may have pronounced his name Mantell, as he is listed as such in places. What then do we know about Thomas from printed sources? Very little. An obituary of Gideon in the Proceedings of the Royal Society, which is the top left, has a first-hand account by Gideon's eldest brother, Thomas Austin Mantell, of the father's business, where it says that Mr. Thomas Mantell of Lewes, a brother of the subject, his father was a shoemaker in the enjoyment of a large business, having as many as 23 men in his employ at one time. Dr. Mantell received his first instruction at a dame school in Lewes, from which he transferred to Dr. Budden's Academy. So far, so good. But then we have in the Gentleman's Magazine obituary the following mention, which tells us a little more about his father. And note that Easter is a mistranscribe from Sub Castro. He was born in the parish of St John Sub Castro at Lewes, where his father was a shoemaker in a small line of business, but of quick parts, and with a readiness of perception and a strictness of integrity, which rendered him extremely useful to Mr. W. Cooper, the leader of the political party supporting the Whigs. Finally, Colin Brent's description of him as a maverick relates to his politics, and the Whig martyr referred to was Algernon Sidney, a member of the Long Parliament, a Republican political theorist, and a commissioner in the trial of Charles I. Later, Sidney was charged with treason and executed, thus becoming a Whig martyr. This is a strange name to call your son, unless you are making a political point. As far as the rest of his life is concerned, Thomas is quite an enigma. Let's see what else we can find out about him. To set the scene, we have Figg's map of Lewes in the 1790s, which is based on an actual survey. This shows the town at the time we are looking at. A growing, prosperous town, still largely within its ancient medieval boundaries, and St Mary's Lane is right at the centre of it. Somewhere, here's my, yeah, here we go. So we have the house, we have the chapel opposite where Gideon was baptised. Top of the road, we have the town hall and session house. We have the White Hart with its stabling, and we have the Star Inn with its stabling, now the town hall. And the coffee house of the Star Inn is, I think, where the current tourist office is. And we have the very new market tower, newly built by Eamon Wilds, local builder, and the location in the centre of the old Church of St Nicholas, the broken church. And we have Baxter's Print Works, and the site of the Lewes Library would have been around here at one point. Going up Fisher Street, somewhere along here, Thomas had a workshop with his business. And then we have St John Street. Yeah. We have the Mechanics Institute and St John Street, where Thomas actually owned some properties, down to here, which is Church Row, St John's, the old St John's Sub Castro Church, back round past the prison, back round past, oops, anyway, you got it, back to St Mary's Lane. So here we are. It's usually been reported that Gideon Mantell was born to lowly parents in a cottage at St Mary's Lane. This description was used by him himself, possibly to show how well he had progressed socially. If we look at who lived where at the time, we can see that there is some truth in this. The layout here is using current numbering in Station Street. It's based on Colin and Judith Brent's comprehensive street listings. And many of the properties on the west side of St Mary's Lane are shown as owned by the Right Honourable Lord Pelham or Henry Pelham Esquire, owner of the White Hart behind. So number 19, it was occupied by a bricklayer, Cornelius Percy. Number 20, John Hogsflesh, a shepherd's house. And those two are now the Pile-In restaurant. Number 21, Richard Champing, a labourer. Number 22, John Harden, a tanner. And Widow Roots, late of George Roots, is at 22. Next door we have Thomas Mantell, cordwainer. Interestingly, he is both owner and resident. Between 1780 and 1788, Thomas was listed as living in what is now 22 next door, before buying and moving into his house, as shown here, in 1788, around the time he married Sarah. The tax is assessed as less than those of their neighbours. I had just a little aside about the house. The house is a timber frame, 3-bay house with a chimney at the back, built around 1700. The extension, which may have been added at the back around 1800 to create more living space. This information is based on a survey carried out by the Wealdon Downland Museum for us on what the structure of the house can tell us about its age. The family had 7 children in all, not all of whom would have been living at home at the same time. And Sarah's youngest child, Kezia, was born when she was 45. We have a little mention here. Number 24, 25 are houses with a flying freehold and possibly one number for the building behind. And number 26 is interesting as listing George Apted as resident next door to the Hother family. 1794, Gideon would have been 4 years old when the smallpox outbreak happened. There is a lot to read here, so I won't read it all out, but you can also get the full description in the Town Book of Lewes, which is edited by Verena Smith. But essentially, one of the Hother children was seen to be at school with smallpox against advice. Apted was requested to remove the family to the poorhouse, but, quote, as his house was his castle, he was determined that they stay where they were. So the constables raised a wooden fence around his house and put a watchman on it. The next day, a town meeting was held, which stated to him that the whole town requested that they leave. He again refused, so it was decided to block St Mary's Lane at the top and bottom, but it was too late and the disease was spreading. Luckily, living locally was Dr. Thomas Fruin, a pioneer of inoculation. Quote, an evil much less to be dreaded than a general infection in the natural way. He had published the practice and theory of inoculation in 1749. And between the 14th and 20th of January, 2,890 people in the town were inoculated. However, of those 46 died, maybe as a result of the procedure or because they had already picked up smallpox. And Fruin differed from Jenner, who became famous for using the less dangerous cowpox for his inoculations and not smallpox itself. And this story has much resonance to us now during our own crisis. Now let's take a look at Thomas's business interests. We know from his son, Thomas Austin, that Thomas employed up to 23 workers in his business. As a cordwainer or shoemaker, these would probably have been as outworkers, provided with the materials and patterns and working in their own homes. Although it was said that he had a business premise in Fisher Street, it could have been a workshop of some sort. And we see here that he took on an apprentice, James Pattison, in 1790. The family's religion is of interest here, as many non-conformists were also tradespeople. Gideon told a friend, although my parents and their immediate predecessors were at comparatively humble stations, being the only tradespeople in a county town, yet they were descendants of one of the most ancient families in England. And one thing that we do know about his family was that they were always on the Protestant side of things, in that their earlier ancestor was executed for supporting Thomas Wyatt's rebellion, objecting to the marriage of Queen Mary with the Catholic Philip II of Spain. However, having moved to Lewes, they played their parts as Headborough's constables and elected onto the Society of 12. And Thomas himself also took a role in local government, as we shall see. This extract is from a letter to Benjamin Suleiman in America from Gideon. Gideon said that, quote, in Charles II's time, when the persecuted family took refuge in Lewes, their names are amongst the fined and imprisoned for being conventiclers. Under Charles II and James II, it became dangerous to avoid attendance at church. We can look up people listed as fined for not attending church, and the Act of Conventicles stated that there should be no more than 5 people together in one place for religious reasons. The following mentions of the Mantell name in the period 6 in the article referred to here. Just to translate this as Richard Mantell of All Saints Parish with a rateable value of £3 in 1675, attended a conventicle in 1670, brackets NA is non-attendance, in 1683, as did his wife, who may have been his second wife, Mary. Edward, his kinsman, was also listed as a resident of St. John sub Castro in 1675, non-attender 1676 to 83, wife non-attender 1676 to 7, brackets kinsman of Richard, question mark. We find them listed as people fined for not attending church. One of the questions I haven't been able to find an answer to, though, is what was Thomas's religion? This chart shows the outline of the different forms of non-conformity in Lewes, with the dates of Thomas's life identified superimposed on with 2 lines. He doesn't seem to appear on the list of Quakers, not the Baptists of Eastport Lane or Foundry Lane. The Presbyterians and Independents of the Westgate Meeting House are all identified and he doesn't appear there, nor do we see his name on the breakaway group who developed the Cliff Chapel on Chapel Hill. What we do know, though, is that he built 2 chapels into which congregations moved, the Methodists in St. Mary's Lane and the Bethesda in St. John Street. It's always been stated that Thomas was a Methodist, and he did have built the chapel that became the Methodist in St. Mary's Lane in 1807. But in 1790, Gideon was said to have been baptised by Reverend George Barnard in the chapel opposite his house in St. Mary's Lane. If these were Methodists, we would need to add in another strand to the chart, which seems unlikely, which would be the green line to link to the Wesleyan Methodists. The recently published book, The Non-Conformist Revolution, by Amanda J. Thomas, has a whole chapter on Lewes, thanks to John Kay, and mentions various Barnards involved in local non-conformity. We know Thomas was of the dissenting faith, and he named all of his sons biblical names, apart from the family name of Thomas for his first son. We then have Samuel, Gideon, and Joshua. Of Gideon, it was said, quote, his retentive memory enabled him when young to repeat large parts of the Bible by heart. Taking a slight aside here, it is interesting to look at whether Thomas Mantell and Thomas Paine could have been aware of each other. Moving to Lewes in February 1768 to take up post as an excise officer, Thomas Paine, aged 31, moved into the house of Samuel Olive and wife of Bull House. Between 1770 and 73, Paine, without the E, was elected a member of the 12 in Lewes. Paine was said to have based his political writings on the Lewes form of local government. Paine was dismissed from service in April 1774, having been absent some time in London. His landlord and future father-in-law, Samuel Olive, was a well-known attender at the Westgate Chapel. Paine's own father was a Quaker and his mother an Anglican, but with possible Methodist leanings. Thomas Mantell would have been 18 to 24 years at the time Paine lived in Lewes. We can't therefore tell if they ever met. There were, however, associates in common between Paine and Mantell. These include the Lee family, the publishers of the Lewes Journal, living next door to Dr. James Moore, where the young Gideon took up his apprenticeship. The Lee family were long-standing friends of Gideon and feature in his diaries and childhood memories. Thomas Paine was author of Common Sense, published 1776 and influenced the American Revolution, and The Rights of Man, Part 1, 1791, Part 2, 1792, linked to the French Revolution, and were radical texts. Many people in the 1790s were highly mistrustful of Paine, and some to this day call him that traitor. However, it could be that looking at his own actions, that Thomas Mantell was more sympathetic. As regards religion, it is stated that Thomas Paine was an early Methodist and had set up a chapel in Sandwich when he lived there. He also preached Methodist ideas in open fields in London. But Amanda Thomas goes on to say, quote, that there is no record that he attempted to do so in Lewes, as any attempt may be faced by hostility, or worse, apathy, given the strong representation at Westgate of the Independents and the Presbyterians. So was Thomas Mantell a Methodist then, as is often stated? We have a quote here from 1824, which gives a bit more clarity as to the nature of the chapel built by Thomas in St Mary's Lane, where the current car park by what was the Chapel Antiques is. The building was erected at the expense of the late Mr. Thomas Mantell and first opened in 1788 by the Reverend S. Barnard of the Countess of Huntingdon's connection. The Independents continued to use it for some time as an occasional place of worship, after which the clergymen of the established performed divine service there to the military. At the time, the barracks were standing in St Anne's parish. It was afterwards used as a warehouse by a wool stapler of the town. But on the 12th of April, 1807, it was fitted up and opened by the Wesleyan Methodists and was subsequently sold to that connection by the widow of the founder. It has been since considered improved. The chapel is vested in the hands of trustees of the Wesleyan connection, and the mode of church government is that laid down by the conference. At the Sunday school of this chapel, nearly 100 children are educated. What was the Lady Huntingdon's connection? During the early 18th century, there was more tolerance and new variations of Protestant religions. Selina, Countess of Huntingdon, visited Lewes and was influential in the building of the chapel in the cliff on Chapel Hill in 1775, by funding and by supporting the development of a preaching college at Trevecca in Wales, said to be Calvinist Methodist rather than Armenian Methodists of Wesley, differing over the route to salvation. Were these perhaps the Independents who used the chapel in St Mary's Lane in 1790? There is quite a lot more to find out on this. A little diversion into Methodism in Lewes. 1784, Methodists broke away from the Anglican Church. John Wesley himself did not visit Lewes, but his associate Whitfield did preach locally. Pictured here is John Dudley, self-taught shepherd and then schoolmaster. He moved into a house in St Nicholas Lane for paper mill employees and was one of the key movers in the development of Methodism in Lewes. There were two sources for the establishment of Methodism in Lewes. Both came from outside the area. A paper mill was opened in about 1800, and many of those workers were Methodists. It is said that they began to worship in a room that had been used as a wool store. This could well have been Thomas's chapel in St Mary's Lane. Also, there were soldiers in the barracks in Lewes, and about a dozen were Methodists. The registration for the first place of Methodist worship in Lewes was taken out by Joseph Parker in September 1806. Parker was a bugler in the regiment stationed in Eastbourne, who stayed and became a local preacher. An author of a paper on early Methodism in Lewes thinks of Parker as the recognised leader of the infant Lewes Society. The dependence of the Lewes Society on outsiders can be seen from the list of trustees here in the transfer agreement, which was following the death of Thomas. The army was present in strength in Sussex from the start of the wars with France in 1793. There were problems, however. Some officers disliked Methodism, thinking of Methodists as a potential threat. The Duke of Wellington had chaplains appointed to combat the danger of Methodism. Others had a problem because Methodist soldiers objected to drilling on Sundays. In Jersey, 1798, such men offered to pay for a sergeant to drill them on weekdays, stating that they would turn out the same on a Sunday were there danger of invasion? However, this was not enough, and many of them were imprisoned. On the death of Thomas, his widow Sarah and eldest son Thomas Austin transferred the building formally to the Methodists, where it stayed until fairly recently, when the Methodists in Lewes combined with the Tabernacle to become the United Reformed, which is at Christ Church. And it was stated in the document to permit persons appointed by the early Methodist Conference to have use of it performing religious worship according to the Methodist faith. But the chapel wasn't the only property that Thomas owned. He owned many properties in the town at the time he died. The story behind these properties is worthy of more research, and the keep has various deeds of sale, leases and mortgages to go through sometime. In the auction held on the 5th of December 1808 at the White Hart, following Thomas's death, we find 3 houses, an orchard and a vacant lot adjacent to St John sub Castro, a large property in St John's Street with adjoining garden, then a paper mill, possibly later a chapel, 7 more in St John's Street, possibly tenanted with stable and garden, a building and a stable in Fisher Street, and another on the east side occupied by his eldest son Thomas, plus 3 properties on the east side of St Mary's Lane. The Fisher Street property was possibly the site of the Postboys Arms, which is now gone, but if you can see the sale details when Beards bought it, included a Mantell as a previous owner. These properties all appear in his will. The family house on the west side of St Mary's Lane was not part of the sale, and his widow Sarah probably stayed living there, as Gideon was recorded as back there with his mother in 1812. He also owned many properties in and around St John's Street. John Dudley had a schoolhouse in St John Street, and the widow of Thomas Mantell was recorded as owning the chapel on the street after 1808. The St John Street story team may have some of the answers here from their research. But there is a quote there saying that some of these were bought being lot 16 of the Sargison estates. And also I have a quote of a garden and orchard adjoining to the last mentioned messuage or tenement containing half an acre in the occupation of the said Thomas Mantell being lot 17 of the Sargison estates. What we don't know is how and when he acquired these properties, which seem to be all part of a sale of the Sargison estates. There's much more work to be done here to get to the bottom of this. Now we'll have a little look at what's going on nationally, politically. As we know, Lewes always has a view. And the national context was certainly interesting during these years. Just a little look at Newcastle House on the High Street, which was the home of the MP, Thomas Pelham Hollies, Duke of Newcastle, who was Prime Minister, but sat in the House of Lords. He owned the house opposite the White Hart, which had been the family seat. In August 1743, Newcastle's brother Henry Pelham became Prime Minister. It became a coffee house where discussions were held on political topics of the day by Thomas's time. John Wilkes was supported by many in the coffee houses and clubs in the White Hart and the Star Inn. He visited Lewes in 1770 when the locals greeted him with peals of bells and applauding crowds' cries of Wilkes and liberty. And issues under discussion in the period were the repeal of the Test Act, which suppressed Catholics, slave trade concerns, later the impact of the revolutions in America and France, and the wars with France. French Revolution 1789 to 93, war with France from 1794 through to the early 1800s, and also 1794 to 5 was a very bad year, bad winter and high prices, and taxes were introduced to pay for the war. In 1795, a petition was raised against the Gag Acts, signed by 300 Lewes residents. I'm not sure if Thomas was one of these. We know that, but we do know that he was a member of the Lewes Society of Dissenters Club that met at the White Lion, where they drank to the Earl of Egremont and to the Duke of Bedford. Thomas, like other property owners and local businessmen, had a vote in the general elections. He was not tied to voting for the Pelham party. As we have seen, unlike his neighbours, his house was not one of those that was owned by them in the street. Poll books show who voted for who in elections. The election of 1796 was held in highly volatile political times. We can see from Gideon's quote here that Thomas was prepared to stick his neck out in spite of any repercussions, where he says, "My poor father suffered greatly in fortune during the war with revolutionary France for Whig principles." Citizen Green stood for the immediate negotiation with the French Republic, repeal of the Test Act and the slave trade. Thomas was one of those who supported Green, and this may have affected his trade. Landlords of pubs The Stag in North Street, the Lamb and the White Lion were Greenites. There is a mystery which may or may not be true, but I'm sure there was some mention of a bust of Napoleon, possibly in the family ownership, but I need to follow that up. But I do know that Gideon wrote favourably of Bonaparte at some point, which was fairly dangerous at the time. Thomas ensured that his children were well educated. And Gideon was a keen scholar and a bright boy. Access to books was key. The Lewes Library was founded in 1786. It had premises in the house and 80 High Street of Mr. Ridge of Westgate Chapel. Other original subscribers were non-conformists, as shown on the list here. After 1808, new premises at 47 High Street, opposite the Star Inn, were taken on, and members paid to borrow books and voted together on what to purchase. These purchases were made through John Baxter's printing company, who also bound the periodicals and printed the catalogues. It carried periodicals such as the Gentleman's Magazine and radical texts. However, it was said that they toned down some of their more radical purchases at the height of the Revolutionary Wars in the 1790s. The French were on the other side of the Channel and threatening to invade. And by the 1st of August 1803, the town was raising a local militia to defend should the French invade. 214 subscribed, the first 210 were taken on. After early instruction at a dame school nearby, it was said that she left money in her will for the young Gideon to continue his studies, as he had been so gifted. Gideon's formative education was with John Button in the Cliff between 1796 until around 1803. We have a quote here where it says that about Mr. Button, it was where a sound and practical commercial education was given by a gentleman whose political sentiments were so accordant with those of Mr. Mantell the father that he was known to be on the government's blacklist. A Baptist and educationalist, Button was known to be at one time listed in Pitt's Black Book for his radicalism. His son John Viney Button, who took over the school, wrote a poem to the Lewes Library Society here. Gideon was then moved to live with his uncle and cousin in Swindon on November 1804 to attend his uncle's dissenting academy for boys, where he stayed until the 15th of January 1805. On his return on February the 3rd, 1805, he turned the age of 15, and Thomas paid £50 to Dr. James Moore to take on Gideon for a 5-year apprenticeship as a doctor. Thomas, in fact, died 2 years later. It has been said that Thomas's handwriting on the agreement looked feeble, as if he was actually already ill. I will need to see a copy of that deed to see if that is true. We will probably never know how Thomas died. However, he did ensure that all of his children were well educated and given a good start in life. Back in those politically interesting times, the late 1790s, we see of Button that his sentiments, oh yes, we've said that, but yeah, the question is, had things become too hot in this town for people who thought like Thomas Mantell, causing him to send his child away to be educated? The next general election that occurred was in 1802. I'm just going to have a slurp for a second. This was won by the independents. The election of Henry Shelley in 1802, as recorded in the Lewes Journal, and Gideon's letter to his uncle described events at the Star Inn of apple bobbing, racing, dancing, and football as celebrations. This coloured and attractive James Edwards map shows the town as it was in 1799. Unlike the Fig map, this map also includes the Cliff and Southover parishes, which lay outside of the ancient borough. Note the town hall at the top of the crossroads at the junction between St Mary's Lane and the High Street. Meetings of the local government were carried out there, as well as regular assizes in Thomas's time. However, it was becoming too noisy and crowded outside on the street. It was taken down in 1810 and the new law courts built across the road from the White Hart. Thomas was listed as at the meetings from 1789 as Mantell, M-A-N-T-L-E, thereafter as Mantell, M-A-N-T-E-L-L, until at least 1796. He was chosen as one of the two head boroughs in 1792. He was one of those who helped to fund the building of the market tower. His signature can be seen here on the annual accounts. Now we have a description of a third election that sounds a much livelier affair. The activities of electors around the infamous election of 1807 are described here. Thomas died on the 1st of July 1807 and may have been unwell at the time. I haven't been able to check to see if and how he voted. But an eyewitness account stated that the moment the polling ended, the mobility, i.e. the mob, tore apart the hustings by the Sessions House and carried the fragments away, claiming immemorial custom. It greeted the result, Sargison being the popular candidate, by tossing rotten eggs into the balcony great room of the White Hart, Fuller's campaign headquarters. Sargison then spoke from a window at the Star, assuring his partisans that a sheriff's scrutiny of the poll would overturn Fuller's trivial majority. So they dragged the colonel and his carriage in triumph up the High Street to rendezvous at the barracks with Whig Confederates marching in from Brighton. However, it follows that though the sheriff refused the scrutiny, and Fuller's victory had proved expensive, as well as the no popery favours he paid for almost 2,000 dinners at the White Hart and as many at the Dorset Arms. The state of the Anglican churches in Lewes is also important to note here. Unlike the non-conformist congregations, many churches were very run down or overcrowded, and people bought or paid for pews. Around the corner from the Mantell home in St Mary's Lane was the All Saints Church, shown here before 1805. Its Reverend Cecil was noted as a good preacher. The building had to be rebuilt into the more factory preaching box style we see today, which was in fashion in 1804, but was disliked by many at the time. There had been no room for the new residents of Friars Walk and Lansdowne Place, so something had to be done. Thankfully, the medieval tower was retained. St Michael's Church had been in similar ruinous state and was rebuilt in 1770. On the back wall is a poem, probably written by Gideon as a tribute to his father. I'll just read it out. Though humble was the lot to thee assigned, the sterling virtues of an upright mind in thee, beloved parent, purely shone, and made content and happiness thy own. And though no sculpture marks thy lowly grave, nor yew nor cypress o'er thy relics wave, the virtuous will respect the hallowed spot, when prouder names than thine shall be forgot. Oh, fain would be he who in these feeble lays attempts a father's and a good man's praise. Follow the bright example thou hast given, and humbly trace thy footsteps up to heaven. Gideon attended St Michael's while he lived in Lewes on the High Street, as it was his parish church, and he himself has a plaque on the wall placed there by his son Reginald. The plaque is quite hard to read in the gloom of the church. However, there is a transcription of it on my Gideon Mantell blog, and the details were at the end of the talk. In conclusion, therefore, Gideon had joined the establishment. He worshipped at St. Michael's, and his children were baptised there. He was the local doctor, and his own memorial plaque in the church, installed by his son, featured his Mantell coat of arms. He had shrugged off his father's humble origins. But in so doing, has he done his own father's reputation a disservice? I feel that more work is required to build a more complete picture of this complex and interesting man, and on this contribution to our town of Lewes. Thomas was truly a maverick in his politics, but somewhat of an enigma as to his religious beliefs and how he built his property empire. I hope to carry out more research once it's possible to get back into the archives. Thomas, however, was not buried at St. Michael's, as St. Mary's Lane came under the parish of St. John sub Castro. You can see the bottom right corner shows St. Mary's Lane. The tithe map for St. John sub Castro shows the outline of the parish. Everyone had to pay tithes, even the non-conformists, and no chapels had their own burial grounds, apart from the Quakers, so they needed to use Anglican ones. To take on public service often required at least a presence in the Anglican Church, if not to be Anglican by practice. And Thomas himself took such a role in local government, as we have seen. Whether he attended church is not known. Some non-conformists did, however, pay for named pews in church, despite being non-attenders. For example, Samuel Olive had a pew at St. Michael's. There's no record I've come across of Thomas paying for a pew rent in St. John sub Castro. St. John's, therefore, was Thomas's parish church. And this too was in a poor state and too small for a growing town. Recorded by John Byng on his tour of Sussex in 1788, he states, "The key not being found, I saved sixpence, nor was the inside worth seeing. On the outside are placed as stoppers up at the archway, 2 old stone coffin lids, around one of which is a curious inscription to the memory of a Danish warrior." The Reverend Peter Goering Crofts was in charge, 1774 to 84 and again 1799 to the 1820s, but was disliked by many as an absentee vicar. He lived in Malling House, where the police headquarters is, and often spent his time fox hunting. In December 1828, Sarah died, aged 73. Gideon wrote in his diary, "My poor mother was interred this morning in a stained grave close to my father, who was buried 22 years since. Thomas Austin, the older brother, is also buried here with his wife. It's quite hard to read the engraving now, but I traced some of them a few years ago. The other brother, Samuel, who was a butcher and innkeeper, and Joshua, also a doctor like Gideon, but who ended up in Ticehurst Hospital, were buried elsewhere. David Arnold gave us a good description of Joshua in a recent Sussex Express. Gideon is in the South Norwood, London. The grave, by the way, is in the graveyard at St. John sub Castro. Gideon noted in his diary, "The proud priest Crofts has obliged me to dig up the cypress I planted on the grave." As we can see from Gideon's verse, he disliked this interference. What though no sable cypress wave, beloved spirit o'er thy grave, thy favourite flower adorns the spot, and proves that I forgot thee not. Forget thee, no, while o'er my brain memory shall still its power retain, thine image never shall decay till consciousness be passed away. He did write very flowery poetry, Gideon. There were also some iron rails at some point, but they have now gone. However, as a postscript, it's worth seeing what can happen if a tree is planted too close to a grave. So on here on the left, we have Gideon's own grave in South Norwood Cemetery, as it was in the 1980s. He created this for his beloved daughter, Hannah, who died young in 1840, and who wished to be buried with her. The grave is Grade 2 listed and designed by Eamon Henry Wiles, the son of Eamon Wiles, who had designed and fashioned Mantell's house and a large part of Lewes High Street, and improvements in the early 19th century. It was dismantled and remade under the direction of English Heritage by the trustees of the South Norwood Cemetery in the 1980s. It should be noted that the pieces were then sent to Lewes as a gift to do with as the town pleases. The pieces are currently broken and sitting in the cellar of the Anne of Cleves house. Various approaches to try and get them brought up, so at least we can see how much of the dedication pictured here can be salvaged, has sadly fallen on deaf ears. I don't know if you can read that, but that's, thank you. I hope you've enjoyed this little run through the life of Thomas Mantell, our Lewes Maverick. And as I've said, there's plenty more to find out. Any questions? I will close the slides in a second, give you time just to have a look. And that's it.
Well, thank you so much, Debbie. I think that's quite
enough.
Yeah, it's quite just trying to get my head around a sort of society where within quite a short period of time, or even at the same time, you could be fined for not going to church, yet you could be quite openly pro French Revolution, and
I know, free speech.
You wouldn't have been fined or jailed for it. And I think
people were. I mean, there were people. Marcus, I think, has his hand up, but there were people who had to leave town and were jailed for backing the wrong side, as it were.
We think what would have happened in, say, 1940 when there was a prospect of invasion, and people were having open discussions like that. I don't think it could have happened.
Yeah.
For the avoidance of any doubt, St Mary's Lane is now called Station Street in Lewes. So I was wondering who the Lewes 12 were, Debbie.
Society of 12 are the people who basically ran the local government. They were elected annually. There were more than 12. And they themselves elected their headborough and their constables. And people ran the town and kept their accounts, and the books of all of their accounts are available to read.
Right. Got a question about Gideon Mantell's grave. Is it West Norwood or
South Norwood?
South Norwood.
South Norwood, yes.
Right.
We've had a lot of contact with the trustees, and they're very good. They've done a lot of work on the grave and improved it.
West Norwood's the more famous one, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes, he lived near there. So he lived at Clapham. He moved from Brighton, having rather failed at his Mantellian museum, and went back to being a doctor. Lived in South London, and that's where his beloved daughter Hannah died. So therefore it was the local grave. He ended up more in the middle of London, but when he died he wished to be buried with her.
Oh. Well, Maria's got a question about female Methodists, which I'm sure there were many. But...
Yes, I didn't see any names of females, but the people who can follow all the Methodist archives up, I'm sure we'll find plenty. But again, possibly a male preacher thing. Although there's Selina, Countess of Huntingdon, female.
Yeah. When did the Jara Chapel come about, Debbie?
That was, it did descend, as it were, from the Chapel Hill group. There's all sorts of splitting, as that table showed, between Presbyterians and different types of non-conformists, and various different groupings were set up. So yeah, there's whole loads of books on it, including the very new one that came out on non-conformity.
I was quite struck by the infamous election and events in Washington a few weeks ago.
Yes, yeah. I think it's interesting that you can get loads of votes by bribing people with dinners. And that was Mad Jack Fuller, I think, who was the one who won. So he obviously thought it was worthwhile. Any other questions? Have I just stunned you all with facts? I want to do a lot more work on this. I just think he's such an interesting character who gets fobbed off in the history books as just being a mere cobbler or shoemaker in a lowly cottage. And as we've seen, he actually owned a large amount of St. John Street. He owned the Church Row leading down to what would have been down into the old St. John's Church, down the side of where the current church is. And obviously it was known in the town, so he knew the town. They would have known him too.
What would the population have been about then?
Ooh, you got me there. Somebody else will know that. It was obviously small, you know. It was a market town, but it was an important market town. And we had, you know, the MPs, the Pelhams, very important family based in the town. There's loads of people out there who know loads more than me. Come on. So, I just think 1790 is a fascinating time.
Yes.
Really, yeah. Sorry.
I can't believe that he didn't have something to do with Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine learnt his governingship, his town governingship at St. Michael's. And you said Mantell was at St. John's of Castro, but you mentioned St. Michael's. So
St. Michael's was where his son's church, because his son lived on the high street and that was his parish church. Everything written about Thomas Mantell was that he was a non-conformist, but we don't know which chapel he would have gone to.
Yes.
But yeah, Paine and they were around. Paine was slightly older than Mantell, but they're in the same town, small town, involved in politics. Could have met. Don't know.
Yes.
Well, I think this is a very worthy lecture in Debbie's personal crusade to have a different talk every year on or around Gideon Mantell's birthday. So glad this was able to happen despite lockdown. Very happy to have you, Debbie.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Yes, look forward to your next batch of research.
Yes.
I
will be finding out more, because he's one of those characters that you just think, hang on a minute, how did that happen? What was he doing? What was he thinking? He was only 57 when he died. He did so much, you know. His son did an awful lot, and his son became, you know, locally, nationally and internationally well known. Thomas probably didn't live to see that, but he certainly gave him a very good upbringing and grounding.
It was quite surprising he owns so much property.
That's really, why and how did he buy it? Yeah.
Yes.
I'm just going to send you anyone interested, the link to registering for the talk next Wednesday on the chat. So if you click on the link, I think it will take you straight to the screen for registering for it. Thank Debbie again.
Thank you, Debbie.
Thank you.
And hope all continues to go well in Wales and you get back
thanks. Yeah.
safely before too long.
Yes. Yeah. We had to sneak over the borders, but yeah, we're here.
You got good reason to be.
Yeah.
And the picture you give is of a town full of those who have beliefs in many things. Thank you. That's very nice, Julian.
Thank you, Debbie. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie.
Thank you, Zach.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody, and thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.